Hello, my talk is called The Male Victims of Partner Abuse, Barriers to Help Seeking and Experience with Services. I'll present the results of a survey of self-identified male victims of partner abuse. It was carried out by the charity Both Parents Matter Cymru, of which I'm a volunteer and former trustee. There were 728 respondents. 95% of the men identified as heterosexual, and correspondingly 95% of partners identified as female. I'll address the following issues: how prevalent is coercive or controlling abuse of men by their partners? I'll look at men's self-reports of barriers to seeking help and experience with services. I'll critique the hypothesis of hegemonic masculinity as explicative of the survey data, and I'll present an alternative hypothesis. We surveyed against both physical and non-physical abuse. 75% of the men identified as being victims of at least one, if not multiple, forms of physical abuse. In terms of non-physical abuse, we surveyed against 12 categories of non-physical abuse, and this histogram shows the number, or rather the frequency with which multiple types of non-physical abuse were experienced by the men. Overall, 99%, essentially all the men, suffered from some of the non-physical abuse categories. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's no definitive measure for coercive or controlling behavior, but these 12 categories of non-physical abuse were arguably, well, certainly most and arguably all, were characteristic of coercive and controlling behavior. In addition to that part of the survey, we also asked for optional text comments, and of course, when you ask for people to write things in surveys, they mostly decline, but we did get a lot of comments, something like 1,800 altogether. And from those, I fished out more than 800 specific instances of coercive or controlling behaviors in those text comments. This contrasts very sharply with criminal justice statistics, where if you look at prosecutions and convictions for coercive or controlling behavior, which is of course a specific offence under the 2015 amendment to the Serious Crime Act, it's virtually entirely prosecutions and convictions of men, 99%, and all those sent to prison for that offence are men. So let's look now at barriers to help seeking. We surveyed this against 5 answers plus an other category, which was less often used than these. And I'll give these nicknames so I can refer to them in brief later. So firstly, I should say the question we asked was, did you seek help for your abuse? And if not, why not? So this is the answer to the question, why not, really. I didn't realize that what I was experiencing was abuse, which I'll call unaware, 51%. I didn't know where to turn for help, which I'll call helplessness, 52%. I didn't think I would be believed, 51%. I was afraid of the consequences of seeking help if my abuser found out, 46%. Or I was too ashamed or embarrassed to seek help, 41%. So let's look straight away at how well those answers to the barriers to help seeking perform against a presumption of hegemonic masculinity as being the explanation. So firstly, what is hegemonic masculinity? Well, it's to be agentic, strong, powerful, confident, independent, self-sufficient, assertive, even aggressive, in control, responsible, dominant, especially over women. And it's said to be a characteristic of men, socially conditioned by the patriarchy, that is, by other dominant men. And now a good hypothesis, of course, must explain many different phenomena, or in this case, must explain the answers to many different survey questions, not just one. So how well does it do first of all, against men's reported barriers to help seeking? Well, it clearly does not align with 3 out of those 5. It doesn't align with the feeling of helplessness, which is the very opposite of hegemonic. It certainly doesn't align with being afraid of your female partner, which again is the exact opposite of being hegemonic, hegemonically masculine at least. And it doesn't align with expecting to be disbelieved. If you're hegemonic, then you feel in control, confident, assertive. You expect to be believed, not disbelieved. However, there's 2 other barriers to help seeking that were identified. The one where men do not initially even recognize their abuse, which I've called unaware, and being too ashamed or embarrassed. Now, both these have in the literature been aligned with hegemonic masculinity as an explanation. You can give verbal arguments for that. I'll not go into the verbal arguments, but just say that if they did indeed both align with that explanation, then the answers to those 2 questions, having a common cause, would be correlated. So you can examine it from the data. They're not correlated. The Pearson correlation is only 0.05 between those 2 answers to the question, and the p-value is 0.3, so it's wildly not significant. So hegemonic masculinity performs very badly against the survey question in respect of barriers to help seeking. Let's look now at experience with services, and we surveyed this against 7 categories, as you can see at the bottom here. In this histogram, the blue bars on the left of each pair indicate a positive response from the service, and the red bars on the right of each pair indicate a predominantly negative response from the service. So you'll see straight away that the police and social services fared catastrophically badly in this survey, with the men reporting both those services being overwhelmingly negative in their response. Victim support was also mostly negative. The other services were more positive than negative, but the only one where that was clearly, emphatically so, were the helplines. However, I'll concentrate on the police and social services because we also asked a question about prejudice. We asked, have you faced any form of prejudice or stereotyping as a victim of abuse because you are a man? So 70% said yes, only 17% said no. And when we drilled into that, we found, not surprisingly, that the prejudice was associated far more strongly with the police and social services than the other services. Not surprising given the negative response. So, having discovered that hegemonic masculinity isn't performing very well as a hypothesis so far, here's an alternative hypothesis, which I'm going to call the male social obligation hypothesis. And the key, I claim, is to recognize that the traits labeled as hegemonic masculinity are actually socially imposed obligations upon men. Their purpose is to extract pro-social behaviors from men, especially responsibility, which of course includes preferential exposure to harms and to blame. So the term hegemonic is misleading because it is actually an imposition on men by society, not the reverse. And society, of course, comprises both sexes. The idea of masculine hegemony is an illusion, I claim, which promotes the male social obligation. The response of the police and social services illustrates how the presumption of masculine hegemony is socially embedded. Disbelief or prejudice is the means by which the male social obligation is enforced. The men's barriers to help seeking, on the other hand, results from their victimhood or their knowledge of their victimhood breaking the hegemonic illusion, whilst these men still appreciate that they live in a society in which that illusion is dominant. So much for the words. But what about the data? Well, there are empirically testable predictions which result from that alternative hypothesis. And they are these. You'd expect the responses to the police, to social services, and to the question about prejudice to be correlated, and hence to form the basis of a factor in factor analysis, because these relate to the hegemonic presumption or hegemonic illusion being the causative factor. That is to say, the hegemonic presumption or illusion is operative within those services, not within the men. On the other hand, the responses to the question about barriers to help seeking, specifically helplessness, disbelieved, afraid, and ashamed, are expected to be correlated with each other, but to form the basis of a separate and independent factor in factor analysis, that is independent from the first one. And the reason is, according to the hypothesis, because these relate to men's hegemonic illusion having been broken by knowledge of their own victimhood, whilst appreciating that they live in a society in which it's still at large. So to examine the hypothesis then from the data, I've looked at those 13 questions, the 5 responses to help seeking barriers, the 7 responses to services, and the question about prejudice. So looking firstly at the eigenvalues of the resulting 13 by 13 covariance matrix, you see there's 2 clearly largest eigenvalues. So let's look at the structure of the eigenvectors corresponding to those largest eigenvalues. The largest eigenvalue has the following dominant components in its associated eigenvector: prejudice, police, and social services. Hence, this dominant factor is as predicted. And it's what I would identify as being the male hegemonic presumption or illusion factor. If you look at the second largest eigenvalue and ask what are the dominant components in the associated eigenvector, they are ashamed, disbelieved, helplessness, helpline, and afraid. So 4 of those 5 are indeed the barriers to help seeking. And the odd one out there, helpline, I note, is the one service that was most positive in its response. And this is the factor I would identify as being associated with the breaking of the illusion of male hegemony. Carrying out that of course is principal component analysis. Essentially, carrying out the full factor analysis confirms that those 2 factors are indeed the dominant factors. So, conclusions. The hypothesis of masculine hegemony performs very poorly as an explanation of the data from this survey regarding men's barriers to help seeking and their experience with services. An alternative hypothesis, the male social obligation hypothesis, which I've offered, provides a more consistent rationalization of the survey findings in respect of those issues. Principal component or factor analysis indicate that the predictions of the male social obligation hypothesis are borne out by the structure of the 2 dominant factors. The data set suggests a high level of coercive or controlling abuse is virtually universal amongst men identifying as victims of partner abuse. But this contrasts with criminal justice data in which coercive or controlling prosecutions and convictions, and indeed being sentenced to prison, are essentially entirely of male defenders, well, 99% of male defendants with female victims. This mismatch between the prevalence of coercive control against male victims, but the criminal justice data which does not recognize it, I claim would also be explicable in terms of the male social obligation hypothesis, as would be the familiar phenomenon of the vanishing of the male victim. Thank you very much. That'll do.